closing argument in the Oscar Pistorius murder trial has been set down for the 7th and the 8th of August. Now, both the prosecution and the defense will present their closing arguments. Personally, I think the prosecution's strongest angle, Barry Bateman, is going to be the neighbours' testimony and what we've heard from people like Estelle van der Merwe, people like Michelle Berger and her husband, Charles Johnson. The fact that they heard these screams before the gunshots, I think the state's going to rely very heavily on that.
Well, they will try and rely heavily on it, they probably will, but I think where the defense is going to come with this, and we've seen it already, it's the establishment of a timeline. Now, on the defense's case, they say that on those two noises that the neighbors heard, they say that those first set of noises, those were the gunshots. Those were the noises that in fact woke up these neighbors. The screams that the state is saying is Riva Steenkamp's terrifying screams before she was killed, they say that those were actually Oscar Pistorius calling for help. And that second set of noises, they say, that coincides with when Oscar Pistorius used that bat to break down that door and rescue his girlfriend. So while the state might want to prove an argument here that led to the shooting, it's a completely different version from the defense.
But you can't argue with the fact that those neighbors, and they were pretty credible in their testimony, they heard those screams and they were all so convinced that it was a woman. But also, if you look at the timeline and you look at Professor Simon's evidence around the post-mortem, he says the stomach contents shows that Riva was awake later than what Oscar says she was awake.
The defense's response to that argument was to call Professor Lundgren, who argued that it is unreliable to determine the time of death based on gastric emptying. She referred to her own experience, but also through academic journals, for example, that showed that depending on a wide variety of factors, it cannot be determined. The state's argument was that food was consumed 2 hours before Riva had been killed. But according to Professor Lundgren, it could be anything up to 8 hours.
See, I think the big issue is going to be around motive, and I'm not sure that the prosecution has sufficiently showed enough motive for premeditated murder. However, they have presented all of those text messages, all of the WhatsApps, in which Riva shows that their relationship was sometimes rocky, and at one point she was even scared of Oscar. Is that motive enough?
Well, the response, what Rue was looking at, is we had, I think, over 1,000 messages, and of those, it was Muller, the Captain Muller from the Hawks cell phone analyst. He had identified 3-4 messages out of those thousands that showed or was evidence of anger or unhappiness in the relationship. I think we spent hours in court going over the booze, the bars, and that's the way Gerrie Nel referred to it, these pet names between this couple. Rue argued that this was a perfectly normal relationship that you would expect. And yes, there would be ups and downs, and there were more ups than there were downs.
Look, the prosecution has to show that Oscar had intent, that he had a guilty mind, and that he genuinely felt that he was being threatened, that he thought that somebody was actually coming at him, that he was being attacked. His argument, of course, has been that he felt threatened, that he felt that he needed to defend himself.
Well, we had psychiatrists coming to testify. We had his own personal physician that came to testify. The orthopedic surgeon who amputated his legs, who spoke not only about Oscar's psychological vulnerability of having grown up being exposed to crime, having a mother who was scared of crime, slept with a firearm under a pillow, but also his physical vulnerability, the limitations on his mobility which fed into this increased fear. Adding all this together and putting Oscar Pistorius in that scene that night, believing that there was somebody in the bathroom, they argue that this was a reasonable way for somebody with this psychological, perhaps condition or situation to react.
But Gerrie Nel doesn't say that. Gerrie Nel says that it wasn't reasonable. He says it's all about Oscar, it's me, he's only interested in himself, and that this was premeditated, that he had intent, that he deliberately shot and killed Riva Steenkamp.
Mandy, what we have is 2 days set down on this Thursday and Friday for the state and the defense to present their closing arguments. Now, these can be described as the executive summaries of these documents, which would have been submitted about a week earlier for the judge to study. Ultimately, it'll be up to the judge to decide whether Oscar Pistorius is guilty of the premeditated murder as he has claimed, or she will rule in favor of the defense and acquit him. But there's also the possibility that he could be found guilty on the lesser charge of culpable homicide. Masipa is expected to take anything from a week to 3 weeks, possibly more, to make this decision in the trial of the century.